On Thursday, 17th of October, we received this news.
Yahya Sinwar is dead. He was killed in Rafah by the brave soldiers of the Israel Defense Forces. While this is not the end of the war in Gaza, it's the beginning of the end.
Yahya Sinwar, the leader of Hamas terrorist organization who was responsible for the October 7th massacre, is dead.
He is the second Hamas leader eliminated by Israel since 7th of October 2023. This is on top of the elimination of Nasrallah, the historic leader of Hezbollah, his successor and senior members of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. VisualPolitik community, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is keeping his promise. Remember that this was exactly what he said he would do following the 7th of October massacre.
בכל החזיתות, עברנו להתקפה. כל איש חמאס הוא בן מוות. חמאס זה דאעש, ונרסק ונחסל אותו, כפי שהעולם ריסק וחיסל את דאעש.
And that is now becoming true. Well, that and more, because during the last year, he's gone straight for all his enemies. Practically not a week goes by without a major casualty among his adversaries. Whether the methods he's employing are to our liking or not, Netanyahu is achieving what is probably the greatest military victory in all of Israel's history. In a single year, it has crushed Hamas and Hezbollah, eliminated the vast majority of their top officials, and decimated their arsenals. And that's not all. Israel has overrun the Gaza Strip. Its troops are carrying out a macro-cleansing operation in Lebanon. It has attacked the Houthis by bombing the strategic port of Hodeidah in Yemen. And it has Iran on the ropes. October 7 will probably go down in history as a strategic blunder of colossal proportions. Probably the biggest mistake of Israel's adversaries in its entire history. Well, the fall of Yahya Sinwar was the latest and symbolically the most important for the Israeli government. Why? Because Sinwar was not only the leader of Hamas, he was also the person who oversaw and gave the green light to the 7th of October preparations. Precisely for this reason, Israel had probably made him its #1 target as early as November 2023.
Sinwar is today Israel's most wanted man. Benjamin Netanyahu, Israel's prime minister, refers to him as a dead man walking. The leader of the Hamas militant group in Gaza is deemed the single figure most responsible for the surprise attack on October 7th.
VisualPolitik community, over the past year, Israel has unleashed an amount of force and fire far greater than anyone could have thought possible. And what is more surprising, despite having Hamas on the ropes and despite the huge, colossal economic bill that this war is costing Israel, the Hebrew government not only does not move towards truce in Gaza, but also, as you will know, in recent weeks, it's extended its operations to the fullest. And what's more, it did so just when the international community, starting with the United States, was finalizing a ceasefire agreement to which Hezbollah had said yes, and to which Israel more or less also said yes. Although the truth is that it never had any intention of complying with it. On the contrary, we now know that it was that possibility that made Nasrallah show up at Hezbollah's headquarters in Beirut. So the question is, why does Israel seem absolutely set on continuing to the end this time? Pay attention, because this question is absolutely crucial. Even for Israel, it's not easy to maintain such a large mobilization of its armed forces and reservists for such a long time. That's why they've always tried to seek peace agreements. It was even something it did in the wars it fought with other Arab powers back in the 1970s. But this time, it's not like that. This time has been completely different. Well, we can find several reasons for Netanyahu's stubbornness. Firstly, we've already told you here on VisualPolitik, for Netanyahu, there are political undertones. This war has turned his electoral situation around. He's gone from being the one to blame for 7th of October to once again becoming the great King Bibi. Then, secondly, there's the hostage issue, which also arouses a certain national consensus, although the families have asked the government to negotiate many times.
Our work is not done. We will not rest until we bring home all our hostages.
Okay, all this is true. But there is something else. We now know that there's an additional motive that is pushing Israel to see this war through to the end, whatever it takes. I'm talking about the plans that Hamas had drawn up and was in consensus with both Iran and the armed wing of the Ayatollahs in Lebanon. In other words, Hezbollah. I'm talking about the fact that Sinwar himself, the promoter and mastermind behind the terrible events of October 7th, was designing and promoting something much worse. His plans outlined completely breaking the status quo and bringing hell to Israel. There was even talk of replicating the US 9/11 attacks in Tel Aviv. Yes, that's correct. Check it out.
more than 230 meters high, nearly 70 floors, and up to 6 underground floors. This is the Moshe Aviv Tower, one of the largest skyscrapers in Israel, a block that is still standing by a miracle. Miraculously, because taking down the Moshe Aviv Tower was one of the targets Hamas was studying for the 7th of October attacks. They didn't succeed that time, but the building was in their sights.
VisualPolitik community, the invasion of Gaza led to Israeli intelligence getting hold of a lot of documentation. Documentation that has been analysed for months, and in which there is everything: attack ideas, target tracking, strategic plans, possible attacks. As I said, this documentation has been under analysis and has recently been accessed by media outlets such as the Washington Post. And guess what? There were plans to attack skyscrapers, to plant bombs on trains, to attack ships and ports with explosive boats, and things of that nature. All with one common denominator: Hamas was escalating its threat a lot. Red lines were being crossed, and Hamas was reaching unprecedented levels of threat without Israel having much idea what was going on. In fact, in the first weeks following the attack, it was widely believed that this was something that had gotten out of hand within Hamas's own leadership. We now know that this may not have been the case, among other reasons, because the initial design of the operation was intended to make the attack even worse. So what were the original plans? What was Yahya Sinwar's role in all this? What plans was Hamas starting to put in place? And what was the role of Iran and Hezbollah in all this? Well, all that we're about to tell you explains why Benjamin Netanyahu has decided that this time there will be no negotiations. Either the enemies give in, or Israel will take the attack all the way, which is, in a sense, what it's doing. Pay close attention. But first, and I can't believe this, still just over 50% of the people who watch our videos every week are not subscribed to the channel. It blows my mind. It's so easy. You just have to hit that subscribe button and the little bell, and that's it. In 10 seconds, 2 seconds, you'll be aware of our news. So when we release the video on a topic that interests you, you'll be the first to know. 2 seconds and 100% free. It costs you nothing, but subscriptions help us a lot, and it really helps you out too. And now let's get into the background of everything that's happening in Israel. Stay tuned for what we're going to tell you next. The Israeli army's advance has succeeded in destroying and dismantling dozens of Hamas cells throughout the Gaza Strip, as well as, not surprisingly, leaving this territory in shambles. However, as said earlier, one achievement that has gone unnoticed, but which is extremely important, is the obtaining of key information from Hamas to understand how this organization operates and how it thinks. And let me tell you that both the Mossad and the Shin Bet, Israel's internal security service, are looking closely at all the details. Most details are still secret, but recently the Washington Post was able to access nearly 60 letters and planning documents from the Hamas leadership. And guess what? They found a big surprise. The October 7th attack was going to be even worse than what we witnessed. Fortunately, many plans were not executed that day, some because of material impossibility, and others because they were postponed. The fact is that thanks to these changes, thousands of lives were saved. Specifically, the base document that the Washington Post has been able to analyze and that sought to prepare the logistics has a very pompous name: Strategy to Build an Appropriate Plan to Liberate Palestine. This planning document was in the hands of the Hamas leadership as of 2022, and let me tell you, it represents a complete change of policy. The Palestinian organization was ready to escalate in an absolutely crazy way.
The Strategy to Build an Appropriate Plan to Liberate Palestine is a documentary archive with over 17,000 photographs, from satellite images to photos of Israeli cities, with layouts and possible targets. And yes, some materials were probably delivered by Iran.
And that's not all. On top of that, Hamas also had detailed plans of Israeli air bases and military installations, and even the schedule and flight patterns of commercial aircraft landing or taking off from Tel Aviv's Ben Gurion Airport. Pay attention to this because it will make the hair on the back of your neck stand on end. Along these lines, one of the most ambitious plans the organization was working on, and even considered including in its macabre October 7 program, was the demolition of some of Tel Aviv's largest skyscrapers. Earlier, we told you about the Moshe Aviv Tower, but it was not the only building under threat. Take a look.
Hamas was preparing to attack a huge complex in central Tel Aviv, comprising 3 skyscrapers next to a large shopping mall and a train station. In this case, the target was not only skyscrapers. Just a few blocks away is the Surisky Medical Center, one of the largest hospitals in the country, with a more than 1,000 bed capacity. A few more meters away is the Tel Aviv Museum of Art. And the icing on the cake, opposite this complex, is the Maktal Tower, headquarters of the Israeli Ministry of Defense and the General Staff of the Armed Forces.
Imagine the chaos, the damage, and the nightmare that a massive attack on this complex and this area of Tel Aviv would have caused, let alone if they had managed to cause massive damage to the tower or even topple it. That would have caused a huge wave of debris, of smoke, of destruction, basically everything we saw in New York a couple of decades ago. Well, VisualPolitik community, that's what they were chasing. And this has naturally alarmed the Israelis, who didn't suspect that Hamas was even remotely involved in this crusade. In fact, the initial plans for the October 7 attack included this target, among other reasons because an attack in this space would have generated enormous chaos and a massive sense of terror, even worse than what actually happened. Look at what the Hamas document said. It couldn't be clearer.
If this tower is destroyed one way or another, it will result in an unprecedented crisis for the enemy, similar to the crisis at the World Trade Center towers in New York.
Not to mention the casualties it would have caused. Nevertheless, within Hamas's plans, this was not the deadliest of operatives. Do you know what strategy this terrorist organization was starting to use to maximize the damage? Well, take a look.
Following the events at the World Trade Center in September 2001, almost all modes of transportation came to be seen as potential targets of a terrorist attack. However, Hamas did not envisage the hijacking and use of aircraft as part of its actions, but rather the manipulation of the Israeli railway system.
Thus, the terrorist group had designed a plan to use railroad freight, especially those transporting fuel. The idea was to take advantage of the fact that they were already loaded with flammable material, introduce small explosives, and detonate them when they entered cities or urban spaces.
The rail line is designed for fuel transport, which is a weak point in the event of a train explosion after moving inside one of the cities.
And take note, because the raiding of cargo trains to blow them up in cities could have been translated into chemical or biological attacks. How? Well, keep in mind that it's common for some minerals and chemicals from the Dead Sea area, such as phosphates and sulfur, to be transported using these cargo trains. So blowing up one of these shipments in the middle of a city would be a terrible thing to do. Do you now understand why Israel wants nothing to do with reaching a ceasefire with Hamas? Now do you understand why Israel has come to the conclusion that it's imperative to end, or at least damage, Hamas and Hezbollah as much as possible right now? In Israel, they have now understood that while October 7th was terrible, it could be worse in the future. Contrary to what was believed, these organizations were not moderating, quite the opposite. And that poses a much more serious problem. The question is why? What on earth caused Hamas to start escalating its goals so dramatically? Well, here we can find several quite probable hypotheses. Among them, the following 3. Pay attention to this, as this may be the key to everything that's happening right now. On the one hand, Arab countries are turning a blind eye to Palestine. For the first time since the beginning of the conflict, the Arab countries not only do not clearly support the Palestinian cause, but they are making a pact with Israel. This was a major blow to organizations like Hamas. Why? Because the support of the Arab countries was essential, not only to have money, but above all, influence. It's likely the October 7th attack took place because of the imminent announcement of the full political normalization agreement between Israel and Saudi Arabia. In other words, Hamas was losing the game.
Seeing themselves cornered, they attacked in an attempt to break up these negotiations, probably to seek a hard attack on the Gaza Strip, and that would win back the solidarity of the Arab community. This did not work. October 7th will go down in history as a huge strategic mistake.
Second, Netanyahu's economic strategy threatened to begin to normalize Gazan relations with Israel, as was already happening in the West Bank. For the first time in a long time, Israel was allowing some Gazans to work in Israel, a number that could grow over time, and that could erode Hamas's position. Not surprisingly, if there are more and more economic ties with Israel, there would be more and more people who wouldn't want things to get out of hand. And third, the pressure and new capabilities received from Iran and Hezbollah. In the absence of Arab support, in recent years, Hamas strengthened its ties with Iran, which gave it weapons, training, and some funding. And if you appear stronger and at the same time you are losing, what do? attack. These three elements probably contributed a lot to the escalation of violence. Well, that and a fourth factor. The Palestinian conflict was completely deadlocked, which generates frustration. And in those cases, you either move or you lose support. However, October 7th did not ultimately include some of these plans that Hamas was working on, and that it shuffled around for this major attack. So the question is, what happened? Well, let's take a look.
A game of telephone.
VisualPolitik community, planning for a major attack is believed to have begun at least as early as 2021. This is confirmed by a series of minutes found in late January by Israeli soldiers following the seizure of the Hamas subway command in Khan Yunis in southern Gaza. As the New York Times was able to ascertain, it all started after Israel dealt heavy blows to Hamas in May 2021. We talked about this.
The Israeli military unleashed a wave of heavy airstrikes on the Gaza Strip early Monday, saying it destroyed 15 kilometers, 9 miles, of militant tunnels and the homes of 9 Hamas commanders.
From that moment on, the correspondence between Sinwar, Hezbollah, and the Iranian political high command intensified, with a tone of greater desperation. As I said, Hamas was beginning to have the feeling that it was losing. Look at the tone of the communications.
We urgently need you to support us with all your strength, determination, and backing, first, to restore our strength and what has been exhausted in this confrontation, and to develop our capabilities many times over.
And it was just at that moment that some minutes and documents found in the Hamas facilities begin to talk about a big project. And not only that, some correspondents ordered to limit attacks or offensives on Israeli interests, because this could hinder the big project. Israel had to believe that things were calming down. From that moment on, Hamas began to reduce its offensive actions throughout 2022 and 2023. It was an operation of deception and concealment in anticipation of the big strike. But the key to making it a truly great coup lay in the support and capabilities that Iran and Hezbollah would give them. So they began to court them more and more lovingly. Since the Israeli attacks of 2021, Yahya Sinwar requested extra assistance from the Ayatollah's regime. Specifically, Hamas asked them for $500 million in funding to be paid in monthly installments over 2 years. The expansion of Iranian training and equipment networks was also requested to form new divisions in order to add 12,000 additional combatants. Sinwar himself promised in a letter that at the end of these 2 years, 2022 and 2023, God willing, we will eradicate this monstrous entity, referring of course to Israel. During that time, both Iran and Hezbollah supported them, but not as much as Hamas leaders would have liked. It's likely that in Tehran, they didn't want anywhere near as savage an escalation as the Palestinians were proposing. After all, they weren't losing. What's more, Netanyahu seemed close to collapse, and the White House had allowed Iran to sell oil again. So why get into such a mess? It's one thing to have Hamas bugging you, and quite another to unleash the war that would have been unleashed if Sinwar and company had succeeded in their plans. Just imagine.
Some documents show that in July 2023, the Palestinians sent a senior representative to Lebanon, where they met with a senior Iranian commander to pressure them to give them the means to attack sensitive targets. They did not receive them. So with less funding, less equipment, and fewer trained and equipped troops, Hamas had to defer many of its objectives.
And yet, October 7th was terrible and has unleashed unprecedented anger on the part of Israel. The strategic error was colossal. Hamas saw it was losing and did the only thing it knows how to do: bite. It did so unchecked, and the results have been terrible. I suspect that in Tehran, they're still gobsmacked. The Ayatollahs are right in the scenario they didn't want to be in, and which is precisely the reason they didn't give Hamas the support the Palestinians demanded.
Nasrallah is gone. His deputy Mohsen is gone. Haniyeh is gone. Def is gone. Sinwar is gone. The reign of terror that the Iranian regime has imposed on its own people and on the peoples of Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen, this too will come to an end.
Be that as it may, discovering Hamas's intentions is what has made Israel understand that half measures are no longer valid. That has pushed King Bibi, as Netanyahu is known in Israel, to go after everyone. And the truth is that, in strategic and military terms, things could not have turned out better for him. Now it remains to be seen how to put an end to this whole story. But let me tell you one thing. This time, Israel is going to have less trouble setting up corridors, exclusion zones, security zones, and all kinds of preventative measures. Here on VisualPolitik, we've already said that we think that without an exit plan, everything is a disaster, and that the suffering of hundreds of thousands of people people does not bode well. The fall of Sinwar is the best news for this conflict, and particularly for the Palestinians. The sooner Israel sees that it has limited the Hamas threat, the sooner this nightmare will end. But at this point, the questions are for you. With this information, if you were the government of Israel, what would you do? Leave us your thoughts in the comments and let's start a debate. And now, if you found this video interesting, don't forget to like and subscribe to VisualPolitik. It will literally take you 2 seconds. Thank you so much for being here. All the best. I will see you next time.